Greetings, friends. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. Today is August 6th, Wednesday. Let's take a look at the most important news from this crazy world in simple language. What do I want to talk to you about today? Donald Trump has announced that he is ready to strike the first blow against Putin. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine, had an unscheduled phone call with the president of the United States, talking about Russia's strikes on Kyiv, as well as joint cooperation and future agreements. In the end, the Kremlin dictator agreed to a partial truce, according to the American press, but there are some nuances. Let's analyze all this together. Before we start, I would like to ask you to subscribe to YouTube channel 24. In the description, there is also a link to my YouTube channel, where I update analytics for you every day. To begin with, if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine on August 8th, when Trump's deadline expires, the United States may impose additional sanctions on its shadow fleet. The Financial Times writes about this, citing sources familiar with the relevant discussions in the White House. According to two of them, the imposition of new sanctions against the oil fleet could be the first step in imposing costs on Moscow. The third interlocutor noted that other scenarios are being considered. According to the Financial Times, the inclusion of Russian shadow fleet vessels in the sanctions list will be the first step of the new administration in imposing new restrictions on Moscow. Back in the administration of the President Joe Biden, 213 tankers used to transport oil, chemicals, and petroleum products were added to the sanctions list. Instead, Trump has so far refrained from imposing new restrictions on Russia, hoping to reach a diplomatic agreement. We know perfectly well that Trump wants to put pressure on Russia's partners who buy oil from it. But here I also want to warn you not to get too carried away by this news, because imposing sanctions is very good. It is also very good to put pressure on the shadow fleet, but we need appropriate structures and mechanisms, which means costs and human resources. You see, imposing sanctions on the shadow fleet is one thing, but monitoring it and who will implement and enforce these sanctions is another. And we know that Donald Trump and his administration are cutting international organizations. We will follow this news because of Trump's pressure on India, and we'll mention this in a moment, and other steps and disappointment with Donald Trump that Moscow is not de-escalating the war in Ukraine. They say that Putin is ready for a partial truce. Russia sees the air ceasefire in the war against Ukraine as a concession to US President Donald Trump. This is how the Kremlin wants to try to prevent the threat of secondary sanctions. However, according to Bloomberg, Russia is still determined to continue its war against Ukraine. Officials say that the visit to Russia of Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, which is scheduled to take place this week on August 6th, provides a last opportunity to reach an agreement with Trump, even if the chances of success are low. One of Bloomberg's sources added that one potential proposal could be to stop airstrikes using drones and missiles in Ukraine as a gesture of de-escalation. But Moscow will only take this step if Ukraine also signs a similar agreement. However, Russian dictator Putin will not agree to a general ceasefire in Ukraine, as his troops continue to make steady progress on the battlefield, and Russia's military goals remain unchanged, the newspaper notes. It is also unclear whether this agreement will contain any conditions that would make it unacceptable to Kyiv. Mr. Witkoff is expected to leave for Russia on August 6th. At the same time, the Kremlin said that he might meet with President Putin. And the authors of the article reminded that American leader Donald Trump threatens to impose high duties on countries that buy Russian oil and other goods starting August 8th. It is worth noting that it is quite possible that Putin will agree to a truce, because our drones are very good at destroying the military and important infrastructure of Russia. Instead, the Russians are simply terrorizing and beating civilians. Putin may agree to this. It is not known whether we will agree, because over the past week and a half I have told you that Russian logistics and railways have been hit very seriously by unmanned systems. And also, the Novokubishevsk and Ryazan refineries, which had hits on August 2, the Ryazan refinery have halved their capacity, and the Novokubishevsk refinery is not working at all. So we also need to look and understand here. But I will remind you that the first time the air ceasefire was mentioned was on March 11th in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, when our and the US delegation agreed on an unconditional ceasefire for 30 days. They agreed on air silence, but Putin disagreed. Now the dictator can make such a seeming compromise in order to demonstrate that Moscow is ready to reduce the escalation. This will be a substitution of concepts. They launch up to 500 drones a night, and when there is a ceasefire in the air, imagine how many drones Russia will be able to accumulate. It will be an unprecedented number. I also told you that nothing was officially announced on August 5th. Trump spoke with Volodymyr Zelenskyy on the phone. Our president announced this on his Telegram channel. What did he write about? A productive conversation with President Trump. The key is to end the war. We are grateful to the US president for all his efforts to achieve a peace. We need to stop the killings. We fully support this. We could have been without war for many months if the Russians had not dragged it out. Zelenskyy also wrote that they had coordinated the positions of Ukraine and the US. The Russians have increased the severity of their strikes. President Trump is fully informed about Russian strikes on Kyiv, on our other cities and communities. Of course, Zelenskyy says, we talked about sanctions against Russia. Their economies continue to fall, and that is why Moscow is so concerned about this prospect. This can change a lot, Zelenskyy wrote. We discussed joint European solutions that can help our defense. We have solutions in the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. More than $1 billion for American weapons, which Ukraine will receive soon. Thanks. This cooperation with NATO countries continues. I want to stop here because the Netherlands allocated $500 million, and Sweden, Norway, and Denmark subsequently announced that they are also ready to allocate $500 million for Pearl Initiative. This is prioritized Ukraine requirements list. And this is actually the same presidential PDA program that was under Joe Biden. The only difference is that under Joe Biden, this initiative was paid for by the Americans, and now it will be paid for by the Europeans. But the most important thing is how it will happen. Europeans are providing funds. These funds will go to the US, and the US will send weapons to Ukraine from its warehouses. In other words, we will not wait for it. We will get it right away. Moreover, let me remind you that the US representative to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, said the other day that he had been instructed by Trump to coordinate this particular Pearl program. And he was already in Poland, not online, not on the phone, but physically in Poland to coordinate the transfer of weapons. Zelenskyy also mentioned, going back to his conversation with Trump, that they talked about cooperation and reaching an agreement in the production and sale of drones. This is also very important. Vehicles from France and Italy, Germany and Poland, Britain and Sweden are going to serve in the Ukrainian defense forces. But before that, we deliver each car purchased at European auctions to a service station where, after a full inspection and repair, we equip it with emergency equipment if necessary. In dark times, you can clearly see the bright people, those who do not wait for the light at the end of the tunnel, but light the way themselves. They give a little now to have everything in the future. And these are you, our dearest ones. We thank you for that. Yesterday, Donald Trump also mentioned India and gave an ultimatum. On Tuesday, Trump said that tariffs against India would be significantly increased due to the purchase of Russian oil. He said the deadline was within the next 24 hours. Today we expect that tariffs for India will be raised. India is the country with the highest tariffs. I will soon raise tariffs on Russian oil for India. We agreed on 25%. But I think I'm going to increase that amount substantially in the next 24 hours because they are buying Russian oil, Trump said in an interview with CBS. He also told that if oil falls by $10, Putin will end the war. But that's not true, because a barrel of oil costs $65 now. If it drops by $10, it will be 55 cents. And we know the sanctions from the EU have put a ceiling of $45. And Ukraine President Zelenskyy and Foreign Minister Sybiga have said that at a minimum, the price of oil should be at a ceiling of $30. Then Russia will experience, and in the long run, if this price holds, problems with the flow of funds from the sale of oil and gas. At $55, what Trump is saying, it won't work. The Kremlin has already responded to these statements and Trump's threats. And of course it was Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov. He said, Moscow has accused the US of trying to put pressure on India through trade with Russia, calling these actions illegal. Peskov said that Russia hears a lot of statements that are actually threats and attempts to force countries to stop trade relations with it. The dictator's spokesman added that Moscow believes that sovereign states should have the right to independently determine their trading partners and formats of economic cooperation in accordance with their own national interests. Do sovereign states have the right? Then the sovereign state of Ukraine has the right to choose where it wants to go. The European Union, NATO, to buy weapons, not to buy. There are some double standards in Russia, because you mention sovereign law, but you do not mention Ukraine as a sovereign state. This is the problem. The most interesting part comes next. Peskov, of course, meaning Putin, says that India has a sovereign right to buy or not to buy. And what does Trump say? Are you buying? And I'm raising duties. It is our American sovereign right to raise tariffs on India. That's why you have to try to put your statements together in a puzzle. India has responded to Trump's statements and ultimatums, and it is partly right. Because it said that it would not stop importing Russian oil, since Western countries themselves continue to trade with Russia. An official statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs notes that New Delhi has started buying Russian oil after the usual supply routes were reoriented to Europe amid the war against Ukraine. Then the US openly encouraged Indian purchases to maintain a stable global energy market. India's imports aim to provide predictable and affordable energy costs for Indian consumers. This is a necessity due to the situation on the global market. However, the countries that criticize India are trading with Russia. Unlike in our case, such trade is not even a vital national necessity. Here, again, India is manipulating a little bit, because Europe gave up oil because Russia invaded Ukraine, and India started buying Russian oil after Russia started a full-scale invasion. Unfortunately, India is right. Because in fact, Europe buys a lot and has a trade turnover of $67 billion with Russia. Only if we mention energy, the situation is less critical. But look, I want to tell you that in total, in 2024, the European Union, and this is confirmed by them, bought 23 billion worth of energy carriers. This is more than 1 billion more than the aid to Ukraine. The European Union is also engaged in double standards. It said, we are for Ukraine, Ukrainians are great, and we buy 23 billion euros of energy from Russia. But I want to give you a little bit of information about how the balance of Russian energy purchases changed before and after February 2022. By the beginning of 2022, the European Union was buying 929,000 tons of Russian oil and gas. China was in second place then, buying 435,000 tons, and Turkey was in third place with 139,000 tons. After Russia began its full-scale invasion, the European Union has actively begun to reduce the volume of Russian oil and gas from 930,000 to 105,000. China has increased its oil and gas imports, and now it buys 607,000 tons. And it has become the country that buys the most Russian energy. India also started buying actively. India bought 9,000 tons before the full-scale invasion, and then it increased 12 times. And now this figure is 345,000 tons. The top three are China, India, and Turkey. Before the war, it bought 139,000 tons, now 240,000. And here it is worth noting that Europe is being disingenuous, because before the 18th package of sanctions, they were buying oil products from India. And knowing that India produces these petroleum products from Russian crude oil, now they have approved the 18th package, and there will be a gap of 6 months. They gave the package a 6-month extension, but what is the result? Europe imposed sanctions and now claims strength and independence. This is also unfair. But nevertheless, I say that duties should be imposed on India because it will affect Russia's ability to receive funds and finance the war in Ukraine. There are problems with oil in Russia. Listen, the Russian budget revenues from oil sales in July fell by 30% this year, compared to the same period in July 2024. This is reported by the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. Falling oil prices and a stronger ruble deprive the Kremlin of vital revenue. Prices are falling, and the ruble, it's strengthened. Look, a barrel is worth about $50. These $50 come to Russia, but for $1 they now get 78 rubles instead of 100. Accordingly, they are filling the budget less. Nevertheless, Reuters says that Putin will not stop firing despite all the troubles, all these pressures, ultimatums. Yes, we have mentioned that he is ready for a temporary ceasefire in the air, but he is not ready to end the war completely. Why? Reuters will say the following, because the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation reported to him that the Ukrainian front is supposed to collapse in 3 to 4 months. Putin also believes that his victory is very close. This means that even Trump's ultimatums will not change the situation. It will be difficult under sanctions, but this will not change his position on the front line at all. And most importantly, Reuters writes that in March, Trump, remember this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in London, where Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio were supposed to arrive, but they did not because, as it turned out later, Ukraine rejected any ultimatums. And before that, there was a meeting in Paris, remember? What did Trump and the US actually offer? Reuters is now saying that Trump's March proposal, which included a ceasefire in exchange for the lifting of sanctions, the recognition of Crimea as Russian de jure as well as de facto, the United States was ready to recognize that Russia had seized the territory it was on, and says that it was actually a gift to the Kremlin at the time. But the Russians rejected these proposals, and they are not ready to stop this war, also because it is much more difficult for Putin to stop the war than to continue it. Because you know this very well, stopping the war means bringing hundreds of thousands of these terrorists home. How do you explain this to them? And what are the goals of the so-called SMO? And there are many more questions that will probably not be answered in Russia. On the other hand, we know perfectly well that they can always explain and convey what they want to the Russians, and they will agree with everything. But it is much easier for Putin to wage war than to stop it. I also want to tell you that the EU is ready to impose sanctions on China, because after Reuters published that China is imposing sanctions and selling UAV engines, There are many parts, including UAV engines, but they are being described as some kind of spare parts for refrigerators. This is how they get around the sanctions. The EU says that we will hit back with sanctions. Hungary, I would like to remind you that for 6 months now, Ukraine has not received military aid from the European Union, because Hungary is blocking it. Once again, Szijjártó and Orbán. Orbán is the Hungarian Prime Minister, and his henchman, the Foreign Minister, who constantly flies to Belarus and Moscow, will be out of politics next year, because they are not expected to win the election for the first time in many, many years. That was the news as of Wednesday morning, August 6th. Be sure to subscribe to YouTube on the 24th. There is a link to my YouTube channel in the description. Don't forget to subscribe. I update the analytics for you daily. Please like, comment, write where you're looking from, and share our conversation. This is very important. This is how YouTube's algorithms work, and in this case, more Ukrainians will be able to watch our conversation. And this means that we promote Ukrainian language content.